Thank you, Ginny. And thank you to the UU Church for putting this presentation on. I'm very happy to be here today. Wow, what a fantastic crowd. This is great. An overflow crowd, I think. I always like to kind of get a feeling off the crowd before I really begin things, so that's what I'm doing at this moment. I do want to do a little housekeeping thing here. At present, I work for a company out of Denver, Colorado called Mary's Medicinals. I do publications for their educational outreach, and many of them are available free out in the lobby. If you haven't already picked them up, please feel free to do so. There's the Cannabis primers in the individual issues. There's Mary's Prime Time, which is a report on current conferences that are ongoing around the world. And then for the policy wonks in the audience, and you know who you are, this is a report from the Brookings Institute on ending U.S. government's war on medical marijuana research. And they were good enough to send those to me, and I'm very happy to give them to anyone who wants to read them. So please pick them up and take them away. Also, you'll see a display out there from the company that I do these publications for. It's Mary's Nutritionals, and they sell CBD products. Is there anyone in the audience who hasn't heard about CBD? Okay. Is there anyone who has? Yeah. CBD is the hot new item, and we'll be talking a lot about that today. It stands for cannabidiol, and it is one of the ingredients in the cannabis plant. But Brad will be at that table, and he can answer a lot of questions that you may have about the products. So let's get started. Is this working?
Try to turn it on.
Okay. So I have been in this marijuana medical issue for most of my adult life, about 45 years to be exact. And you can all say it, wow. I often say it to myself. It's really stunning to think of. As Ginny said, I am a pioneer. My husband and I were pioneers. We got into this issue back in 1975. We got into it the hard way. We got busted. But there's a little bit that comes before that, so let's get started here. People talk about medical cannabis now, and they say, a few months ago I had somebody call me and say, oh, we'd like you to come out and talk about how quickly this medical cannabis thing has happened. My gosh. And, for somebody who's been in the issue for 45 years, to hear that this has, happened so quickly, that was a good chuckle. And for some reason, the way that our minds work, when she said that, I immediately thought of this interview I saw back in 1984, 1985, with Tina Turner. She released her album that year, Private Dancer. And I remember seeing an interview with a very earnest young man saying, gosh, Miss Turner, how does it feel to be an overnight sensation? Well, for anybody who knows Tina Turner, she was hardly an overnight sensation. She and her husband were on the road for at least 20 years before 1984, and she, as they say, paid her dues. But she took the question very graciously. She gave one of those wonderful chuckles that she can give. And her response was, it feels great. I feel pretty much the same way. It's really wonderful to see what is happening with medical cannabis these days. Because when my husband and I started out, and there he is, I call this our salad days picture. This is in 1972. He'd been diagnosed about 6 months before this picture was taken. He'd been diagnosed with glaucoma. Now, you can see he's quite young there. He's 24 years old. And in 1972, young people didn't get glaucoma. It was a disease of old people. And even though my husband had noticed symptoms of glaucoma, even in his late teens, and at one point even found a flyer in his eye doctor's office that talked about glaucoma, and he asked the doctor, gosh, could I have glaucoma? And the doctor said, oh, no, son, no, you're much too young to have glaucoma. You need to stop reading as much. Get outside, play sports. Well, he did have glaucoma. And when it was finally diagnosed, it was quite advanced. The doctor told him he had about 5 or 6 years of remaining life. And that's a pretty sobering diagnosis to get when you're 24 years old. At the time, he had moved to Washington, D.C. He hoped to become a speechwriter. He had graduated from the University of South Florida with a master's degree in rhetoric. But he couldn't find a job, so he was driving a cab at the time of his diagnosis. Well, that had to stop because not only was the disease blinding him, but the medications that the doctor gave him were very blinding. And so he was in kind of a rough period of time. And a newfound friend in Washington, gave him a marijuana cigarette. Now, Bob and I had smoked marijuana when we were in college in the late 60s. But after moving to Washington, he didn't know anybody. He didn't know anyone to ask for marijuana. But a friend knew of the troubles that Bob was having, and he gave him a marijuana cigarette. And Bob was feeling kind of low one night. He looked out the window at the streetlights and saw tricolored halos. And he knew that was a sign that his eye pressure was elevated and that he was going blind. And he thought, well, the heck with this. I'm going to smoke this joint. I'm going to have a little fun. So he put on some music, poured himself a big glass of Coca-Cola, sat down to listen to the music, smoked the joint. About 40 minutes later, he got up, and he went past the window, looked out at the streetlights. The halos were gone. And he put it together immediately that marijuana was helping him. But intellectually, he couldn't believe it. Because this was 1972. Marijuana didn't have medical value in 1972. It's kind of like young people didn't get glaucoma. There's a lot of things we didn't know in 1972. So he thought about it, but he dismissed it. But he couldn't put it out of his head. And bit by bit, he proved it to himself. And then he told me, and I laughed. I didn't believe him because remember the time, 1972, 1973? Medical marijuana didn't exist at that time. Not in America, not anywhere. The prohibition had been extremely effective in terms of eliminating the medical memory about the medicinal uses of cannabis. And incidentally, I'll be using cannabis and marijuana interchangeably today. Marijuana is a slang term for cannabis sativa or cannabis indica. So if I say cannabis, I mean marijuana, and vice versa. So once I accepted that Robert needed marijuana, then we did everything we could to keep him in supplies of marijuana. And that included growing a few plants on our back sun deck, and we got busted in August of 1975. And, you know, they say that getting arrested with marijuana can turn your life upside down, and it did. But within a few weeks of being arrested, we learned that the federal government not only was aware that marijuana had medical value, they actually had researchers at the UCLA in California who had proven that marijuana consistently lowers your eye pressure and had speculated on the concept of using marijuana for the treatment of glaucoma. And this was in a report that went from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to the U.S. Congress. And when Bob found this out, he was just furious. He wondered why it was that he had glaucoma and he didn't know about this, And then secondly, he wondered why he was getting arrested for using a medication that the US government already knew might be helpful to him. So we decided to fight the charges against us. Even though they were only misdemeanor charges, we could have paid a fine and walked away. But we couldn't walk away from the glaucoma. The glaucoma would always be with us. We could face this problem again in just a few years' time, perhaps. So we decided to fight. We launched a two-pronged attack. We fought the criminal charges against us on the basis that Robert needed medical marijuana as a necessity. And then we also petitioned the federal government for permission to use their supplies of marijuana. Because when Robert went to UCLA to be tested, tests which showed conclusively that he needed marijuana in addition to his conventional glaucoma medications. When he went to UCLA, he discovered that the federal government was already rolling marijuana cigarettes into a nice little cigarette. They look like Pall Malls. Anyone remember Pall Malls? And so we figured, well, the federal government has these things. Let's ask for them. So we did. And in November of 1976, both things came through. He was found not guilty by reason of medical necessity, and he received federal supplies of marijuana to treat his glaucoma. And this is one of the headlines from the time. One of my favorites. Bob smokes pot and it's legal. But the real headline is at the top. One man in 213 million. For a few years, Robert was the only individual in the country legally allowed to use marijuana for medical purposes. And it was kind of like getting arrested. The federal government would have been delighted if we had just taken these supplies of marijuana and quietly gone away. But we knew there were others out there that needed medical marijuana. So we couldn't just pay the fine and walk away, and we couldn't just take the marijuana and walk away. Because we knew there were too many others who needed this help. Because within just a short while of these headlines going out, the phones started ringing. The letters started coming. And we knew that there were plenty of other people who wanted what Bob had. They wanted legal access to marijuana. And so a movement was born. It's not something we set out to do, but it's something that came our way. And, you get lemons, you make lemonade. And that's what we did. We founded a nonprofit association called the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics, which was the first nonprofit association dedicated to medical cannabis. And for the next 25 years, we worked together. And until his death in 2001, we worked together to do whatever we could to reform state, federal laws that prohibited people from gaining access to marijuana. And we made some pretty good progress. Medical cannabis, the whole movement, it's really about patients and it's about science. And those 2 points lead to the tipping point, which I'll get to in a little bit. But once the news got out about Bob, here he is on the first day he received his marijuana. These are the federal supplies here, and you can see it looks just like Pall Mall. And so he would receive a monthly supply for the rest of his life. But we started hearing from others, and really they were from everywhere, every corner, of all ages, all disease categories. There were diseases that we had no idea marijuana could be helpful with. Things like Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis. Moving into the 80s, AIDS patients began to call us. Diabetes, neuropathic pain, epilepsy. All of these disease categories kept opening up to us. And so an organization was founded. And we started first trying to change state laws. This young man here is from New Mexico. He was a cancer patient. And Lynn Pearson was his name. And he and Bob hit it off famously. And Lynn came to us and said, I want what Bob has. I want legal marijuana. And Bob said, well, you know, Lynn, you have something that I don't have. You have a state legislature. We lived in Washington, D.C. at the time. He said, Lynn, you have a state legislature. Let's get the legislature to give you medical marijuana. And so we moved forward to enact a law that would give the citizens of New Mexico legal access to marijuana if they had glaucoma or cancer. And that bill passed in 1978. That may surprise you, it's a long time ago. And it passed overwhelmingly. So Lynn Pearson was one of our earliest allies. And if you look at this map, you may think, oh, well, that's a map of today. Right? That's all the states that are legal today. But actually, this map is from 1979. Because what happened, once New Mexico passed their law, then, believe it or not, Florida was one of the next states, and then Louisiana, and I can't remember the fourth one right now. All these conservative states, because really, the right to medical care is a very conservative, a true conservative issue, okay? But all of these conservative states started passing the laws. And the next year, a bunch more did. By the time Ronald Reagan became president, there were 34 state laws recognizing marijuana's medical value, and trying to establish statewide programs of research. It would have allowed the State Department of Health to establish this program, let patients into the program, and then report their findings to the FDA. Well, we thought this was great, because what the federal government was saying all the time was, well, there's no research. And now we had 34 states that said they wanted to research. Well, the federal government didn't want research all that. They obfuscated, they did what they could to keep programs from getting established. In the end, of those 34 states that set up these kind of programs, there were only 5 states that actually managed to get a program going. So it was a good idea, but it didn't get anywhere. Nevertheless, if you look at that map from 1979, 1980, and then look at today's map. Now, you see some states are dark green. That means they allow something other than CBD. They allow THC, usually in flower form, vaping form. But the pale green states are CBD-only states. And that means that only CBD is available. And that's significant. In just a few minutes, you'll see why. So here we are. And I apologize, this is not quite as accurate as I would like it to be, but honestly, folks, things are changing so fast, it's very hard to keep up. But I want you to keep this map in mind. It'll be back around again. So we had a patients movement going that passed state laws, and then in the 90s, they started to file petitions, get ballot initiatives going, and so here we are today, with only 4 states that don't have some kind of medical cannabis law. The second factor that's important in this medical cannabis movement is science. And when you hear that there's no science, there's no evidence, don't believe it, folks. There's a lot of evidence about medical marijuana's effectiveness. And most importantly, there's a lot of evidence about how cannabis interacts in our bodies. In 1988, they discovered we have cannabinoid receptors. Now that was a big deal, because if you have cannabinoid receptors in your body, the body doesn't create receptors for external products. The body has receptors for things that it produces internally. Now, things that come externally, Dr. Dan can answer a lot of these questions a lot more than I can, but things that come externally can react with those receptors. But once they found those receptors, they went, wait a minute, something else is going on here. So they started looking around a little bit more. And these are the 4 people who really pulled together all of this science. And around 1992, they discovered that we had something called an endogenous cannabinoid system. All human beings have it. All mammals have it. We create cannabinoid-like substances in our bodies. So when we smoke cannabis, or ingest cannabis, or put it on our skin, or take a tincture, it goes into our body looking for those receptors. And what they found out about this endogenous cannabinoid system is that it controls our homeostasis, which is a 50-cent word for balance. Homeostasis is the human body's balance. Controls your temperature, controls the endocrine system, controls the functions of your organs. And this is important because it helped the scientists understand how a substance like cannabis could help someone with glaucoma, someone with multiple sclerosis, someone with neuropathic pain in their feet, somebody with Crohn's disease. These are not related diseases, folks. How could one substance help all of those disease categories? Well, the answer is in the endogenous cannabinoid system, the ECS. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test, okay? I won't even make you say the word, it's okay. But you need to know that you have this, because that's why cannabis works so well. That's why CBD works, because we have these receptors. We are, to coin a phrase, hardwired for cannabis or cannabinoid-like substances. It's important to point out that flaxseed creates cannabinoid-like substances. So when you have flax on your cereal in the morning, it's getting digested and it's going out looking for these receptors. Okay? So it's not just cannabis. It's not like we have receptors in us just for cannabis. The body has its own system. Now this was huge news. Maybe not to all of the world, but it was huge news in the scientific world. And I really think it was one of the most important scientific discoveries of the late 20th century. And it really set off an enormous boom of research around the world. Scientists realized immediately the importance of this endogenous cannabinoid system and the implications that it would have for designing medications. This is a very simple graph. PubMed is our online data search service for the National Library of Medicine. And you can see back here in 2000, there were just about 200 reports on cannabis. Look up here in 2017, pushing 1,600. So that's just a very simple indication of how rapidly research took off in the late 90s and into this century. And the countries with aggressive research, sadly, we're not one of them. And I say that quite sincerely. I know many researchers in this country that would love to get their hands on cannabis more easily to research it. But because of our existing federal laws, it's enormously hard to get a hold of cannabis. Imagine, in a world awash with cannabis, the only people that can't get it are researchers in America. It's nuts. But that hasn't deterred other countries. Israel is amazing in its research, amazing in its industry. They recently they passed a law so that they can export cannabis to other countries. Some fascinating research coming out of Israel. In Spain, very interesting research being done there, excuse me, with cannabis and certain variants of breast cancer. It's very exciting research. Canada, our neighbor to the north, where they've had medical cannabis since 2000. 2000. And they recently went to general legalization, adult legalization. So cannabis is much easier to get in Canada, both for adults, but also for researchers. I think there's going to be really a dramatic uptick of research coming out of Canada. And then Czech Republic, Uruguay, little Uruguay down in South America, first nation in the world to legalize cannabis generally. And then the Netherlands, I think we're all familiar with the smoke shops in the Netherlands. I think what the Netherlands is best known for is really exciting cultivation research. And the areas that they're looking at, these are just a few, by the way, but these are the ones that excite me the most. I have a friend in Manatee County by the name of Kathy Jordan, who has lived with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, for 28 years. 28 years. It's unheard of. And the only difference is that Kathy has used cannabis consistently throughout her treatment. Dementia. I think some of the research being done with dementia is incredible. They're showing that very small amounts of THC can help stave off Alzheimer's. Very small amounts. And I have a friend in California, a doctor by the name of Jeff Hergenrather, who treated a patient in a nursing home with dementia. And she was incredibly constricted. She would sit in a chair, and her arms were in like this. Her head was down. And she did not talk. She never relaxed. She barely ate. And her family came to Jeff and said, "We really want to try our mother on cannabis. Can you help us?" And he did. And within a couple of days of starting cannabis tincture, I believe it was, the woman began to relax. Then she started to interact again with family, started to eat again. Her whole quality of life changed because her family went to bat for her and tried cannabis. It's just remarkable stories like that. I've put down the clicker there, okay. Cancer, it has remarkable anti-tumoral properties, but not for all cancers. This is still an area that needs a whole lot of research. And Crohn's disease. I have a young friend he's back in Illinois now. When he was 15, his father and he moved to Colorado. He had Crohn's disease. He has Crohn's disease. And when Colton arrived in Colorado, he was in a wheelchair. But they started him on cannabis, and within a few months, he was climbing hills, hiking, and the imaging of his colon before cannabis versus after is like night and day. It's amazing. And I saw recently an Israeli doctor from the Ministry of Health saying that in his opinion, it's just unbelievably incredible what cannabis can do for people with Crohn's disease. So just a few of the areas that they're researching. So we get to the tipping point, the overnight sensation time, okay? For Tina Turner, the tipping point was Private Dancer. Every issue, it seems, has a tipping point, that moment that you can point to and go, oh yeah, that's when it really took off. Most of you are probably familiar with the Gladwell book that the tipping point expression comes from. It's been around for quite a while. I think the tipping point for medical cannabis was a documentary by Sanjay Gupta in 2013. It's called Weed. There have been a couple others since then, Weed 2, Weed 3, etc. But, when I saw this was going to be on, I was just, oh God, oh no. First of all, the name, right? Weed. And Gupta was not known for being open-minded with respect to medical cannabis, quite the opposite. He had made some very definitive statements that he was not in favor of it. He didn't think it was appropriate. So I figured this 2013 special was just going to be a disaster. But I tuned in, and I have to admit, I was wrong. I was totally blown away. Dr. Sanjay Gupta in August said that we have been terribly and systematically misled for nearly 70 years in the United States, and I apologize for my own role in that. I apologize because I didn't look hard enough until now. I didn't look far enough. I didn't review papers from smaller labs in other countries doing some remarkable research. And I was too dismissive of the loud chorus of legitimate patients whose symptoms improved on cannabis. There's our link back to the patients. Patients have been so important to this movement. This moment, ladies and gentlemen, I think was medical cannabis's turning point, because you had a national figure on TV admitting he was wrong and apologizing for it. It's one thing to admit you're wrong, but to say, I'm sorry for my role in it, was a very humbling thing for him to do. And I think it had a very dramatic effect on America. He also told the story about young Charlotte Figge, who was a young girl with intractable epilepsy, and about a CBD medication called Charlotte, they named after her, Charlotte's Web, and how that medication was stopping her seizures. So instead of seizing for dozens of times a day, Charlotte Figge had stopped seizing and was starting to live a more normal life. These quality of life stories, we all know. We're all old enough in this room to understand that it's quality of life that's important. And, I don't like to say that cannabis can cure things. There are some people who will argue with me about that. But I know that cannabis can really improve the quality of life for so many people. And it is just criminal that we are not allowed to aggressively research this substance in this country. So we're back to our map. Remember, I told you it was coming back. And the reason is that those light green states, those are all CBD-only states. And of the 15 or so that are up there, 13 of those laws passed after the Gupta documentary. It had an enormous impact on America. Because honestly, I think America's been waiting for somebody to say, I was really wrong about cannabis. We should be looking at this more aggressively. But it's not just America. This is a map of Europe. Now, I apologize because it's not quite as precise as the American map. There are some, and don't get the idea that you can go to Europe and use medical cannabis anywhere. You can't, okay? The laws are different in each country. But all these dark green countries recognize medical cannabis and have some kind of law allowing access. Up there in little Estonia, they're about to pass a law. And Turkey is also about to pass a law for medical cannabis. And then Central and South America. Amazing. Colombia, which was once the home to the drug cartels, they've legalized now for medical cannabis. Many, many young entrepreneurs down there building a new industry that will help the people, both medically and also in terms of industry and work. Chile, Argentina, and there's a little Uruguay that I mentioned earlier. In Brazil is still CBD only, but there's a very active patient movement there. Far East. Thailand, on Christmas Day, legalized cannabis for medical purposes. South Korea. These are not bastions of liberal activity, folks. This stuff has something going for it. Now, and you see China is pink. This crowd's old enough to remember Red China, okay? But I put China pink because we don't really know what's going on in China. It's against the law there, but boy, they're exporting a lot of hemp. So something's happening there. But it gives me a moment in my presentation to pause and say, for those of you who are looking at CBD and who are buying it or are about to buy it, be very careful about where it's produced. because a lot of the hemp that's coming in from China has heavy metals in it. Hemp is very good about actually cleaning soil, sucking up heavy metals. Pesticides, it's dirty, and that gets transferred into the CBD. So if you're buying CBD, make sure you know where it is made, and check it out before you buy it. And do shop around, because honestly, there are some, it's like snake oil, folks. I'm sorry, and I hate to say that, but it is. You just need to be careful what you're getting and how much you're paying for it. Because there's a lot of people out there taking advantage of this particular issue right now. So we still have problems. And one is the federal intransigence. Marijuana must be removed from Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. There's just no other way to put it. It's defined as having no accepted medical value in the United States. Now, you remember that map. If that isn't accepted medical value, I don't know what is. So that's our number one problem. We have to start being honest about cannabis, and that starts with scheduling. Medical access by zip code. Why should patients in one state be able to get full access to full spectrum cannabis while patients right next door can only get CBD? Maybe they need THC. They should have access. There needs to be a national standardized program of access. And doctors need to be better educated. Which brings me to the intellectual failure of the medical establishment. And I could go on for another hour about that. So many doctors have just stuck their heads in the sand and said, no, it doesn't work, I don't want to learn about it. Thankfully, Dr. Dan's not one of them, and thankfully many other doctors and nurses, advanced registered nurse practitioners in many states, I'm not sure about Florida, I think they can prescribe. But there are clinicians who are embracing this and who are taking the time, as Sanjay Gupta said, to listen to the patients, to listen to what their patients are saying. And medical cannabis programs are now being consumed by recreational programs. This happened in Washington State, where they had a medical cannabis program for many years, but then when they approved general legalization or adult legalization, they decided, well, we'll just close the medical cannabis program and put it in with the general legalization program, and we'll put the whole thing under the Department of Alcohol and Tobacco. Now, previously, the medical cannabis program had been part of the Department of Public Health. Now, if you're a medical cannabis patient, who do you want overseeing your care? I want the Department of Public Health. Because medical cannabis is different than recreational cannabis. And it's not the same, you just don't go into any store and buy any marijuana and get medical effect. Well, you might, but that's not the right way to do it. Most medical cannabis patients need far less cannabis than those who are seeking to get high. And I don't mind that they get high. I don't mind that there's general legalization. But I do mind when medical patients who need special care are lumped into this kind of Cheech and Chong legacy that we have. Medical cannabis is serious. Patients need the same quality cannabis each time. They need to know exactly where it's been grown. They need to know what the percentages of THC, CBD. The recreational weekend user, he or she's probably looking just to get a little bit high. And all kinds of cannabis can do that to you. It's a different issue. And thankfully, as you've seen from the map, here in the States, we've understood that. And we've passed the medical cannabis programs. But we can't allow these programs to be folded into general legalization. In Canada, the Canadian Medical Association, in October, when Canada went to general legalization, the Canadian Medical Association said, well, that's great, now we can close down the medical cannabis program And people can just go to the dispensaries and get it. I'm happy to say that the Canadian Nurses Association came out very strongly against that, because they recognize the difference. But I think that demonstrates both the intellectual failure of the medical establishment and also the problem with medical cannabis programs being shut down because general legalization has taken over. So those are some of the problems that I see. I'm about out of time. I do have a couple of books for sale outside. My memoir, which would go into much more of what Bob and I did during the 25 years that we worked on medical cannabis, and also Mary's Cannabis Primers collection, which would give you 4 of those little pamphlets that many of you picked up, all 4 in one volume. So I thank the UU Church for letting me come and speak, and I know that you're going to enjoy Dan's speech, but I think we have a little break first. So